Hi guys, we're going to start this unit on hydrology by talking about water. All right. So first of all, when you normally think about water, you might think about things like water that you can drink, or water that you could take a shower with or wash your car with. But in terms of like the amount of water on Earth, the vast majority of the water is located in the oceans. All right. And the reason that that's important is that ocean water is salt water, and we can't use salt water to do something as simple as just drinking. All right. Most of the water that we find useful as humans is actually in what we call fresh water, which is water that doesn't have salt dissolved in it. All right. And so that makes up only about 2.8% of the world's total water. All right. So those two percentages would go here and here in the guided notes. Okay. So what makes things even more interesting is of that 2.8% of the world's water that is fresh water, most of it is not drinkable because most of that fresh water is in the form of glaciers. All right. So this part of that 2.8% is actually frozen water, and we can't obviously drink frozen water. All right. So 2.15% of the total world's water is in the form of frozen glaciers. All right. Okay. About 0.62% of the world's water is in the form of what we call groundwater, which is, for example, after it rains, the water that sinks down into the ground, think of the ground like a sponge, that is called groundwater. So when you think about like where does the water that comes into your house come from, it normally comes from places like rivers and lakes. All right. And so how much of that kind of water do we have on Earth? If you look at this tiny light blue sliver right here, that makes up less than 0.01%. All right, that's what you can write here. So of the water that we is easily accessible to us as humans, only a very, very small percentage of the total Earth's water is in that form. So the thing about the Earth's water is that it doesn't always stay in the same place. All right, water that's on the ground can get evaporated and go to the sky and make clouds, and those clouds can then rain, and that rain can fall onto the Earth and can go into a river, and the river can flow into the ocean. And so what we call this cycle of water going from one part of the Earth to other parts of the Earth is what's called the water cycle. All right. The cycles on Earth are always in balance, which means that you're never going to have too much of the water in the form of the atmosphere, because if that happened, clouds would form and it would rain and water would flow down to the Earth and it would eventually run off. So balance is just the concept that these types of things tend to keep the same percentages from time to time. So this slide right here shows some of that balance. All right. For example, a lot of the world's ocean water eventually evaporates. This would be the amount from there. A lot of the world's fresh water evaporates. All right. Where does that water go? It goes into the air where it makes clouds eventually, and those clouds eventually are going to create some form of precipitation, either rain or snow. That's going to fall back to the Earth. That water is then going to eventually run off and eventually make it to the oceans, or it's going to sink into the ground, and that groundwater will eventually make it out to the oceans. But this is a continuing cycle of what we call the water cycle. All right. So the Earth's annual precipitation has to equal the amount that evaporates. All right. And that's because no water really ever leaves the Earth. It doesn't, when it evaporates, it doesn't make its way into outer space. So anything that evaporates has eventually got to come back down to Earth in the form of precipitation. So there are 6 total processes that are involved in the water cycle. The first is evaporation. All right, if you pour a cup of water onto a sidewalk and wait for long enough, you'll notice that the water is eventually gone. Where has the water gone? It has evaporated to become part of the air. All right, transpiration is something that happens with plants. Water from that's in the soil can get absorbed into a tree, for example, and eventually make its way to the leaves. All right, water in the leaves can eventually make their way into the atmosphere. This process is called transpiration. Condensation is when water vapor in the air, and I just want to be clear, water vapor in the air is completely invisible. All right, if you're seeing clouds, you're not seeing water vapor. All right, so what happens when clouds are formed is that the water vapor in the air turns into small little liquid droplets. All right, that process is called condensation. One way that you might have seen condensation is when you're breathing when it's really cold outside. When you see that smoke, what appears to be smoke coming from your breath, that's condensation of the water vapor in your breath that's turning into small little liquid droplets. Okay, so precipitation is when the liquid water in the clouds comes back down to Earth. All right. So precipitation, usually we think of rain, but it can be in the form of snow, sleet, hail, fog. The next process is runoff. All right. When that liquid eventually makes it to the Earth, it's got to flow into streams, and the streams eventually make their way out to the ocean. Some of the streams get caught up into lakes, but eventually water is going to find a way to make it back to the ocean. All right, infiltration is another way that water can make it from the ground to another place, and that's when water sinks down into the soil. And that water can eventually, even though it's in the ground, it can still travel between the dirt particles and eventually make it to another place.